Good morning from beautiful Spectacle Hint Monday. Now, I know the UK has some pretty strange place names, but that's not why I'm calling this hilltop, actually the ridge on the way out to Vanabig in the Brecon Beacons in Wales, Spectacle Hint Monday. That's because that's the three-word designation in the ingenious sounding what3words system, a system that allows you to refer to any place on the surface of the planet Earth with just 3 words. What3words gives every 3x3 metre square a 3-word address. So on my ascent, I pass through halt dark tentacles, disband louder flies, sketching collects digests, and so on. The reason this is worth doing is because giving the more conventional numerical GPS coordinates to a similar level of accuracy requires 5 decimal places. So I'm currently at 51.87617 degrees north, 3.40097 degrees west, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, unlike the what3words equivalent, police's package stays. It's obvious how this could be helpful. Imagine I was trying to meet a friend, or more critically, if I was in trouble and trying to communicate my location precisely over a dodgy phone connection with Mountain Rescue. So this sounds like a great idea. Sadly, what3words has some pretty serious problems, and the company behind it has a nasty tendency to issue legal threats to nerds who try to point those problems out. So let's take a look at the mathematical, geographical and linguistic factors that mean that what3words sounds really useful, but is more of a global positioning fail. Let's start with the maths. The total surface area of the Earth is 510 million kilometres squared. And that means if you want to divide it up into individual 3x3 metre squares, you're going to need almost 57 trillion of them. 57 trillion is 57, so obviously 2 digits, followed by 12 zeros. And that means if we want to give every one of these squares a number, it's going to need to be 14 digits long. And that's going to be quite a mouthful to read out over the phone or use to arrange meeting a mate. So how can we improve on this and need fewer digits to refer to a given square? Well, we can change the base we're using. For example, the normal numbers that we use every day from 0 to 9 are called base 10. And what we could do is try using letters instead, which means effectively base 26. Now that does help, but going from base 10 to base 26 only gets us from 14 numbers to 10 letters. And a string of 10 random letters is still going to be pretty tough to remember. We're going to need a bigger base. And this is the stroke of potential genius behind what3words. We can use bases far higher than 10 or 26, and we can do so using something that most people already know, words. So what3words uses 40,000 words, which is basically base 40,000, which is enough to give every 3x3 square on planet Earth addresses with just 3 digits in base 40,000, or as we more usually call them, words. 3 words is far more memorable and quicker to communicate with our puny human brains than a string of 10 letters or 14 numbers. This sounds like a great idea in principle. So, what goes wrong in practice? 1. Uses confusing language. The first thing is that 40,000 is just a lot of words. Most native English speakers have a vocabulary of something like 15 to 20,000 word families, known to linguists as lemmas. For example, the verb to run is a lemma, which can also be used as runs, running, ran, or whatever. So 40,000 unique lemmas would be over twice the average English vocabulary size, meaning that what3words would need to delve pretty deep into the dictionary in order to get as many lemmas as they needed. Lemmas in the high 30,000s include linguistic gems like nuclear, curmudgeonly, and ingenuous. Not ingenious, ingenuous, the opposite of disingenuous, which you probably don't want to be trying to pronounce or spell over the phone in an emergency situation, especially if you're a non-native speaker, or if it's just really windy like it is today. You'll be pleased to hear that none of these appear in what3words. So how does it get to its 40,000 words? Well, what3words relies on simple variations of more common lemmas, which 2. Means confusing addresses. The addresses in what3words are confusing because they often use very similar words, such as words which are derived from the same lemma, like, for example, singular and plural forms of the same word. In fact, of the 40,000 words used by what3words, 7,697 of them also exist in their plural form, which means that 15,924 of the words, very nearly 40%, differ from one another by just a single letter S. And it's not just plurals. What3words also contains words like once and once, recede and reseed, insight and insight, incompetence and incompetence, which seems appropriate. There's even pokey and pokey, which are two different spellings of a word I'm not sure I've ever seen written down before. It's not hard to imagine that people, potentially in a stressful emergency situation, might accidentally misread or mishear these words, especially over a bad phone connection. What3words claims that similar addresses are positioned far apart on the Earth to reduce the risk of this kind of confusion. And at first, that sounds like it makes sense. If I called Mountain Rescue and was like, help, I'm near Pen y Fan at Horns Unloads Owns, then they'd type that into their edition of What3words and be like, sir, that doesn't make any sense. Horns Unloads Owns is in Alaska, over 6,000 kilometres from Pen y Fan. And I'd be like, oh, I'm sorry, I misread it. I actually meant Horn Unloads Owns, and that would clear things up. That sounds good, but imagine if my phone ran out of battery at that exact moment. Then they'd have literally no idea where I was, apart from probably not Alaska. The worst of all possible worlds is if similar addresses are plausibly close together, but actually inconveniently far apart. And guess what? There are quite a few of those in What3words. Imagine I was just down there in the valley behind me, and I made a similar emergency call. Help, I'm near Pen y Fan at employer neatly always. Then the emergency operator might think that was quite plausible, because employer neatly always is just a few hundred metres from the summit of Pen y Fan. Unfortunately for me, I'd be 4.5 kilometres away from that location, at employers neatly always, just by changing employer from the singular to the plural. This might not raise any immediate red flags, but would take Mountain Rescue an awfully long time to get from one to the other, especially in bad weather, for example. Exactly the kind of time someone's likely to get into trouble.
3. Offends people easily.
Another consequence of having so many combinations of 3 words is that some of them are hilarious or downright offensive. In fact, quite a lot of them are. They filtered out the swear words and some others which have obvious second meanings, but if, like me, you're a child, you can still amuse yourself. For example, long, slippery passage. This in Tokyo. Or if you're having trouble, you might find that jelly eases entry in Louisiana, as it were. Beats stiff member can be found just down the road from here in Cardiff. Cowboy position preferred is in Newfoundland. While these are all entertainingly inappropriate, there are some places where this could be insensitive or just incredibly offensive. For example, What3words gives the location of their offices in London as filled count soap, which seems like an odd choice at first, because that particular 3x3 square is actually underneath a nearby road. Until you realise it's been quite carefully chosen, because just 2 squares away, and actually closer to their offices, is indeed Cowboy Scam, which would reflect less well on their corporate values.
Hi, Andrew in the edit here. When I was double checking this for the map graphics, I realised I'm actually talking about the wrong building. I assumed that What3words HQ was in this building, because it's closest to filled count soap. But it turns out they're in this building, and I think they've chosen filled count soap as their address because this square contains the gate to the car park. But it's really hard to tell without actually going to visit. It's almost like they're trying to use their own offices to highlight all the flaws in using What3words as an addressing system. Oh, and thanks for ruining this perfect single take, What3words.
What business would want Indeed Cowboy Scam as the address of their head office? Or, equally, you might be a bit upset if you're a family of colour living at the home labelled Dark Monkey People in Phoenix, Arizona. Or maybe a person of below average height living at Disliked Midget's house in Yemen. There's Eradicate Dark People on the east coast of China. Not a country with an entirely unblemished record when it comes to treatment of minorities. And closer to home, Remove Dark People is here in the UK, in Barnsley. Why not visit human traffic camps in northern France? Also politically fraught, there's Conflict Diamonds Bought in Russia, or Remove Traitors' Heads in Gabon, which only abolished the death penalty in 2007. There are presumably hundreds more strange, rude, or racist squares to be found in homes, businesses, and sacred sites around the globe. It's just not practical to police all possible permutations of 40,000 words to avoid any kind of offence. Okay, so What3words is confusing, potentially offensive, and probably unsuitable for emergency situations. But perhaps these flaws are worth overlooking if it's great at solving some other problem. In his TED Talk, what3words CEO Chris Sheldrick explains that one of the major applications is to improve the ability to specify addresses in the developing world. Now, that might sound quite niche, but it's really important because a functioning address system and postal service can help with everything from vaccination drives to boosting economic growth. But what3words has 3 serious flaws when trying to address this issue.
4. Overlooks.vertical.positions.
One of the most serious flaws in what3words as an addressing system is that it provides no way to describe which floor of a building something is on, because the 3-word addresses are inherently two-dimensional. This means that anyone living in a multi-storey building, including lots of people in poorer countries, can't completely specify their address. They even explain this in the FAQ on their website, using their own head office as an example. what3words HQ is at Filled Count Soap, on the 3rd floor, Studio 301. Sure, that does specify their address, but it's no longer just the simple 3 words and nothing else they're trying to sell it as. Surely the whole point of the system. So any governments in the developing world hoping to use what3words as an address system are still going to need a proper address database to store the extra information. Things like vertical position or which of 2 doors in the same 3x3 square a parcel should be delivered to, or whatever. It's exactly the lack of this kind of database infrastructure that's one of the big problems in poor countries with no formal system of addresses. So what3words changes and possibly slightly simplifies the problem, but it certainly doesn't solve it.
5. Ignores.Earth.Moves.
This stuff might look pretty solid, but actually the ground moves, and quite a lot in certain places. In fairness to what3words, this is an issue with any mapping system that doesn't compensate for it, including plain old latitude and longitude. But it's a pretty big problem if you're claiming it'll work for reliable addresses. For example, after the earthquake in Japan in 2011, the land beneath quickly Earth movement moved about 1.5 metres, meaning that about half of what was in that square is now in anyway.nature.instance, which seems like quite a casual thing to say about an earthquake. Even absent earthquakes, the movement of the Earth's tectonic plates is surprisingly rapid. The whole Australian plate is moving by about 6 or 7 centimetres every year, meaning that the contents of rock moves fast in Perth will have moved into Wing's major plates, which itself almost sounds like a comment on rapidly drifting tectonics in about 50 years' time. If 50 years sounds like a long time, think about how long a conventional street address can last. 10 Downing Street, London, the residence of the UK Prime Minister, has had a constant street address since 1779.
6. Wording.Translation.Complex.
Another issue with what3words as an international addressing system is that not everyone in the world speaks English. Many of the words in the English what3words are going to be difficult or impossible for non-native speakers, and what3words isn't available in many of the languages spoken in poorer parts of the world. And even in those languages that what3words has been translated into, there are some serious issues. For example, there's no simple way to translate from one language into another. Let's take German, and specifically Danger Belly Womb, which is a potentially mother-upsetting name of a square near the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. The German translation, Gefahr Bauch Gebärmutter, is in the South African countryside. And I actually didn't choose that one to be offensive. In fact, many of the addresses can't be directly translated into another language at all, and the only way to find out what a given square is called in a different language is to ask the self-appointed gatekeepers of geographical labels. what3words.
7. meanest.company.ever.
All of these things could be dismissed as teething problems, and perhaps we could fix them. But what3words has a nasty tendency to issue legal threats to the people who try to help. For example, in 2019, security researchers reverse engineered the what3words algorithm and posted an open source implementation to the internet called what3words. Unfortunately, what3words responded to this by requesting that it was taken down under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. what3words has also contacted Twitter to remove tweets linking to copies of the what3words code, and continues to send out legal threats to anyone using or talking about it, claiming copyright infringement. The what3words algorithm is patented, and it's clear that the company hopes to make its money by acting as the sole guardian for this list of words and licensing out its use for profit. However, this business model, coupled with the aggressive legal action, means that the product they're providing is impossible to thoroughly test for robustness. The people they're issuing with legal threats are exactly the people who've uncovered the issues, like the algorithmic flaws that place similar addresses very near to each other, that we've been discussing. So far, this strategy hasn't even resulted in a huge profit. Their most recent accounts for 2019 show that the company made £400,000, but it spent over £15 million, resulting in a £14.5 million loss. And that's bad news if you want to build a sustainable mapping service. If the company continues to hemorrhage cash at this rate, then the addressing system might fail for financial reasons long before it does, thanks to plate tectonics.
Make maps better.
So what can we do? Here's my proposal. It's called 4 words find where, and the first innovation, as you've probably guessed from the name, is to use 4 words rather than 3. And that's because when you're using a base n counting system, you get a huge amount of extra value just by adding an extra digit, or of course in this case a word. With a dictionary of say 2,000 words, there are 8 billion 3-word combinations, but 16 trillion 4-word ones. And that's a huge amount of extra space just for adding an extra word. Then I propose that we should make the squares larger. I think we should try 5 by 5 metres over land and 10 by 10 over the ocean. This obviously means that you need fewer squares, especially over the sea. And since oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface, that's a big saving. Using 4-word addresses and larger squares, we go from needing 40,000 words to needing fewer than 1,800. And 1,800 is few enough that we can start imposing some serious constraints on the words we choose, like excluding plurals, making sure they're less likely to be rude, and choosing them specifically to be easily and directly translatable into multiple languages. This will probably be quite a lot of work, and I'd be disappointed in the British sense of innuendo if there aren't at least a few funny ones. But it should be far less offensive and confusing than what 3words is. If we are going to find a niche for word-based geolocation, it's vitally important that a potentially widely used safety-critical system like this is developed in an open, collaborative way with mapping experts, linguists, and people in the communities they're trying to help, rather than handed down from on high with a secret, unchanging algorithm to turn locations into words. If we're careful, I think that an open-sourced 4 words find where at least has a chance of finding its place, while what 3words, clever and cute though it sounds, just seems hopelessly lost.